The Zethrian scout ship Harmonious Inquiry had been floating near the edge of contested space for many cycles now, and Science Director Kvalith was getting bored with the routine work of cataloging new species as they slowly emerged into the wider galactic community when the long-range sensors picked up an unknown vessel drifting near what the Zethrians called the outer margin. Kvalith felt a small flutter of interest in their secondary hard chamber and ordered a standard scanning procedure, which was something they had performed literally thousands of times before without any problems whatsoever. The ship that appeared on their displays looked primitive by any reasonable galactic standards, and Kvalith could see crude fusion drives that seemed barely functional, outdated shielding technology that most species had abandoned millennia ago, and hull plating that was so thick it seemed almost barbaric in its construction philosophy. The Zethrians on the bridge relaxed visibly because this was clearly just another species that was barely crawling toward the stars and probably didn't even understand basic gravitational manipulation, yet Kvalith initiated the deep scan protocols to assess threat level and technological capacity before making first contact, which was standard procedure for the Concordat when dealing with primitive species that might panic at the sight of superior technology. Then the data started flowing back into their systems, and nothing made sense anymore. The ship's reactor output was reading at levels that seemed physically impossible because those power generation numbers should have torn any vessel apart from the inside out. Yet this ship seemed to be running perfectly fine with multiple reactor cores operating simultaneously. The weapon signatures made absolutely no sense to anyone on the bridge because the scanners were detecting chemical propellants like something from the ancient history databases. Nuclear warheads, which most civilized species had banned for ethical reasons. Railgun systems that required enormous power consumption. And what appeared to be experimental energy weapons all integrated into the same weapons platform. It was like discovering a starship that was armed with both primitive swords and advanced plasma cannons at the same time, which violated every principle of logical technological development that Kvalith had ever studied. But what made Kvalith's secondary heart stop beating for several moments was the biological scan of the crew compartments. Those readouts showed living beings that were surviving in environmental conditions that would kill most sentient species within minutes, and the radiation levels alone should have been lethal. Yet these creatures seemed perfectly comfortable. The temperature fluctuations inside the ship ranged from near freezing to almost boiling in different sections, and the acceleration forces that the vessel could produce would crush a Zethrian into paste against the bulkheads, and there were over 2,000 of these beings crammed into that single vessel, living and working in conditions that seemed designed for punishment rather than long-term habitation. Kvalith's primary analyst Vecran was frantically cross-referencing the biological data with every known species in the galactic database and coming up empty with every search query. Director: these beings have internal skeletons made of calcium compounds, and their bodies contain iron-based oxygen carriers and a liquid suspension system. Vecran reported with a trembling voice that betrayed deep concern about what they were seeing. They breathe a corrosive gas mixture that would poison most of us, and their cellular structure shows evidence of deliberate genetic modification for radiation resistance and rapid healing. Vecran continued while more data streamed across the displays. Translation Matrix was working on decoding the ship's identification transponder and linguistic databases, trying to make sense of the complex symbolic language that these beings used for communication. When the translation finally completed, Kvalith felt both their hearts freeze in their chest cavity as the ship's designation appeared on the main view screen in letters that seemed to pulse with barely contained aggression. SC Indomitable, Destroyer-class Warship, United Nations Space Command, Terra Prime, Registry. The word destroyer echoed in Kvalith's mind like a death knell, because if this massive Heavily armed, overpowered vessel was what these humans considered merely a destroyer-class ship. Then what in the name of the Eternal? Spiral did their actual battleships look like HFY ordered the bridge crew to maintain distance and continue passive scanning only, with strict instructions not to make any moves that could be interpreted as hostile by these newcomers. The cultural database that had been extracted from the human ship's publicly accessible information networks was even more terrifying than the weapon scans had been. These humans had only achieved spaceflight capability within the last century, which was practically yesterday in galactic terms. Yet they had already spread across multiple star systems and established colonies on dozens of worlds. Their history was an unbroken chain of warfare, conflict, and violence stretching back thousands of years before they ever left their home planet, with wars involving millions of casualties being recorded as recently as 2 centuries ago. Every technological advancement in human history seemed to have military applications developed before civilian uses, and their entire civilization appeared to have been shaped by an evolutionary arms race against themselves. The Zethrians had been a peaceful species for over 50,000 years, and the last time the Concordat had seen actual warfare was so long ago that it existed only in archaeological records and ancient historical texts. Director, they are hailing us, the communications officer announced with audible fear in their voice modulation. Violet straightened their carapace and tried to project calm authority, despite the terror coursing through their nervous system because they were the ranking Concordat official present, and this first contact was now their responsibility. Open the channel, Kvalith ordered, and the view screen shifted to show the interior of the human bridge. The being that appeared was clearly the vessel's commander based on the deference shown by the other humans moving in the background, and Kvalith noted immediately that this was a persistent predator species with forward-facing eyes. Designed for tracking prey, the human was female according to the biological markers and stood with a relaxed posture that somehow conveyed both confidence and readiness for violence in equal measure. Unknown vessel. This is Science Director Kvalith of the Zethrian Concordat. Kvalith began with carefully modulated tones meant to convey peaceful intentions. We wish to establish peaceful communication protocols with your species. The human smiled, showing flat teeth that suggested an omnivorous diet capable of consuming both plant and animal matter. And Kvalith tried not to think about what those jaws could do. This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Nations Space Command. The human replied in a voice that was surprisingly warm, despite coming from such an obviously dangerous being. We're happy to talk, Director, because we're explorers after all. Golith's translator matrix struggled with the concept because the word the human used for explorers carried connotations of both discovery and conquest in their language structure. Admiral Chun, your vessel is quite impressive, Kvalith said carefully while trying to gather more information. Our scans indicate significant military capabilities. And may I inquire whether the Indomitable is primarily a military vessel or research platform? The human's expression shifted slightly, and Kvalith's pattern recognition software flagged it as amusement mixed with pride. She is a military ship. Director, specifically a destroyer in our fleet classification system. Admiral Chun responded with clear affection in her voice when referring to the vessel. Kvalith felt their breathing spiracles contract in instinctive fear because this monster of a ship with enough firepower to subjugate an entire star system was classified as small in human terms, a destroyer. Kvalith repeated slowly while trying to process the implications. Would you classify that as a small warship in your fleet composition? Mid-sized. Actually, the Admiral said casually, as if discussing something completely ordinary. We have frigates and corvettes that are smaller, and cruisers and dreadnoughts that are significantly larger. The Zethrian bridge went completely silent as every crew member absorbed what they had just heard. Kvalith realized with growing horror that humanity had stumbled into galactic space with a fleet composition designed for total warfare. And nobody in the Concordat or any other peaceful species was remotely prepared for what was coming. Admiral Chun, would you be amenable to arranging a formal diplomatic meeting between our peoples? Kvalith asked while already composing the emergency report that would need to be transmitted to the Concordat Council immediately. We would be honored. Director, the human replied with that dangerous smile. In fact, why don't you and a small delegation come aboard the Indomitable for a cultural exchange, and I can show you around our ship. Every instinct. Kvalith possessed screamed warnings about entering the lair of an apex predator, but refusing would likely cause diplomatic complications that could lead to conflict. We accept your generous invitation, Admiral Chun, Kvalith said while signaling their crew to prepare an away team. We look forward to learning more about humanity as prepare. A priority transmission to the Concordat Count. Admiral Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the UNSC Indomitable and watched the alien vessel that had been following them for the past 6 hours while trying to determine whether these new contacts represented a threat or an opportunity. The sea alien ship was beautiful in a way that human vessels never were, with smooth organic curves and what appeared to be bioluminescent patterns running along its hull that served no obvious tactical purpose but looked impressive nonetheless. Lieutenant Okoye spoke up from the sensor station with her usual professional tone that never wavered even when reporting potentially dangerous situations. They're scanning us again. I am, and this time they're using deep penetration scans that are getting a really good look at our internal systems and crew composition. Chun nodded slightly because she had expected this level of curiosity from a species that had probably never encountered humans before and was trying to assess what kind of threat humanity might represent. Let them look at everything, Chun said calmly while walking over to the tactical station. Commander Parks, what's your assessment of their vessel's capabilities? Commander Parks had been in the Navy for 20 years and had seen action in the corporate wars, so his tactical evaluations were usually accurate and conservative in their estimates. Advanced technology, ma'am. Far beyond what we currently possess, Parks reported while highlighting various sections of the alien ship on his display. Their energy shielding is probably several generations ahead of our best systems, and their propulsion appears to use some kind of gravitational manipulation that we don't even have theoretical frameworks for yet. Parks paused to review more data before continuing his analysis. Their weapons are mostly energy-based and appear designed for precision strikes rather than overwhelming firepower, which suggests they value efficiency over brute force, Parks said thoughtfully. Ma'am, here's the interesting part. Their ship is built for speed and efficiency above all else. Chun raised an eyebrow and gestured for him to continue with his assessment. The hull structure is optimized to minimize mass while maximizing performance, and there's almost no redundancy in their critical systems, Parks explained. It's elegant engineering, but it's also fragile. I don't think this vessel has ever seen actual combat because the design is too pretty for warfare. That was the fundamental problem with most species in the galaxy. Chun reflected silently while considering the implications of Parks' analysis. Humanity had clawed its way to the stars through 2 devastating world wars that killed hundreds of millions, countless regional conflicts that never seemed to end, and the resource wars that nearly rendered Earth uninhabitable. Humans had built their first interstellar warships while still actively fighting each other over territory and resources. And every system on the Indomitable had been tested in actual combat situations against real enemies. The bridge lighting shifted slightly as the communications officer flagged an incoming transmission. Admiral They're hailing us now, the communications officer reported. Put them on the main view screen. Chun ordered while straightening her uniform jacket. The alien that appeared was like nothing Chun had seen before. With a vaguely insectoid body structure and large prismatic eyes that seemed to shift through different colors as they processed visual information when it spoke. The translation software rendered its speech into English with what seemed to be an undercurrent of barely controlled fear in the vocal patterns. Unknown vessel. This is Science Director Kovaloth of the Z3 Concordat, the alien said with careful formality. We wish to establish peaceful communication protocols with your species and hope that our presence has not caused any concern. Chun smiled in what she hoped was a reassuring manner and stepped forward so the alien could see her. Clearly, this is Admiral Sarah Chun of the United Nations Space Command, she replied warmly. We're very happy to talk with you, Director Kovaloth, because humanity is always eager to meet new friends out here among the stars. She deliberately used the word friends to set a peaceful tone because first contact situations could go wrong very quickly if both sides got nervous. She watched as Kovaloth's mandibles twitched in what the translation software tagged as a stress response. Admiral Chun, your vessel is quite remarkable, Kovaloth said carefully, as though choosing words with great precision. Our scans have revealed significant military capabilities, and we were wondering whether the Indomitable serves primarily as a military vessel or perhaps as a research and exploration platform. Chun understood immediately that Kaleth had seen something in the scans that made the Z3 nervous and was trying to assess how much of a threat humanity represented. The Indomitable is absolutely a military ship, Director, Chun said honestly, because lying during first contact was usually a bad idea. She's classified as a destroyer in our fleet organization. The color seemed to drain from Galeth's carapace, and Chun noted the physiological response with interest. A destroyer. Kovaloth repeated slowly, as though testing the word. Would that be considered a small warship in your fleet's classification system? Chun shook her head slightly. Mid-sized. Actually, she replied casually, we have smaller vessels like frigates and corvettes for patrol and escort duties. And we have much larger ships like cruisers and dreadnoughts for major fleet operations. The silence from the other ship was profound, and Chun could see multiple Z3s in the background, stopping their work to stare at the view screen. I see, Kovaloth said quietly. Admiral, if I may ask, why does your species maintain such extensive military capabilities? It was a fair question, and Chun considered how to answer it without sounding aggressive or paranoid. Director, humanity has been in space for less than a century. Chun began. In that relatively short time, we've encountered rogue artificial intelligence that tried to exterminate us. Corporate interests that started shooting wars over mineral rights. Pirate raiders who prey on colony ships, and 3 separate alien probe incidents that attempted to sterilize human settlements. She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. The galaxy might seem peaceful from your perspective, but humanity learned a very long time ago that peace is something you have to be strong enough to defend, Chun explained. Every human ship is built on one simple principle: hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Kovaloth seemed to process this information carefully. Your species has clearly suffered greatly. Kovaloth said, with what sounded like genuine sympathy. We've survived, Chun corrected gently. And we've learned from every challenge that we've faced. There was a pause as Kaleth consulted with someone off-screen. Admiral Chun, would you be amenable to a formal diplomatic meeting between our peoples? Kaleth asked. We believe that direct cultural exchange would be beneficial for mutual understanding. Chun smiled broadly, because this was exactly what she had been hoping for. We would be honored. Director, she said, enthusiastically. In fact, Why don't you and a small delegation come aboard the Indomitable and I'll personally give you a tour of our ship while our chef prepares a meal that accommodates both human and Zethrian dietary requirements. She could see Kovalov hesitate and realized that the alien was probably terrified of entering what they perceived as a death trap. I promise you'll be perfectly safe aboard my ship, Chun added. And I think you'll find that humans are much more hospitable than our weapon systems, might suggest. Kovalov's mandibles twitched again, but the Zethrian agreed to the meeting after the channel closed. Commander Parks approached Chen quietly. Ma'am, do you think it's wise to show them everything? Parks asked. If they're scared now, showing them our capabilities up close might make things worse. Chun shook her head. Commander, they're going to report everything they've seen to their government, regardless of what we do, she said. Better that they meet us face to face and realize that we're people, not monsters. She looked out at the stars beyond the bridge windows. Besides, fear based on ignorance leads to conflict, Chun continued. Fear based on understanding leads to respect. And respect is something we can build on. Parks nodded slowly. Prepare the ship for visitors, Chun ordered. And make sure everyone understands that these aliens are our guests and will be treated with every courtesy. Yes, ma'am. Parks replied. Chun returned to her command chair and reviewed the first contact protocols. One more time humanity was about to step onto the galactic stage, and the impression they made in the next few hours would shape interstellar relations for generations to come. She intended to make sure it was a good impression. Even if the Zethrians were currently terrified of what they'd discovered, the Indomitable represented everything humanity had learned about survival in a hostile universe. But it also represented humanity's hope for a better future. Chun just had to make sure the Zethrians understood both sides of that equation. The alert chimed, indicating that the Zethrian shuttle was requesting docking clearance. This is it, Chun said quietly to herself. Time to show them who we really are. She stood and headed toward the hangar bay to greet their guests personally, because some things were too important to delegate. The future of human-alien relations was beginning right now. Kvala sat in their command chair, aboard the Harmonious Inquiry, and tried to process the nightmare that was unfolding across every display screen in the bridge, while their crew worked frantically to compile all the scan data into a coherent report. This vessel that the humans casually called a mid-sized destroyer was unlike anything in the Concordat's extensive military history databases. And the more data that came back from the deep scans, the more terrifying the picture became. The humans had built redundancy into absolutely every system on their ship, and Kvalith could see multiple reactor cores operating simultaneously when most species used a single primary reactor with maybe one backup for emergencies. The life support systems had triple redundancy with independent backups for each major section, and the ship could apparently seal off damaged compartments and continue operating even if a third of the vessel was completely destroyed. Valid's military analyst Vekran was comparing the human warship specifications against Concordat military vessels from the ancient wars, and the results were deeply disturbing. Director, look at this, Vekran said, while highlighting sections of the scan data. The human crew doesn't use stasis fields or inertial dampening technology, which means their bodies just endure the brutal physics of space combat through sheer biological resilience. Kvalith examined the data and felt their breathing spiracles contract in horror. Their acceleration couches can handle forces that would turn us into liquid, Vekran continued. And their combat doctrine apparently involves maneuvers that would kill most species just from the G-forces involved. The weapons analysis was even worse than the structural scans had suggested, Director. Their torpedo magazine alone carries enough destructive power to crack a small planetary moon, Vekran reported with a trembling voice. And they have 73 torpedo tubes loaded and ready to fire. Plus the railgun batteries, the missile systems, the point defense laser network, and what appears to be experimental plasma cannons. Kvalith stared at the numbers and tried to comprehend the sheer overkill that humans had built into a single mid-sized warship. They've turned their entire ship into a weapon. Vekran said quietly, every system has a secondary combat application, and even their cargo bays can be rapidly reconfigured as additional weapons platforms or troop deployment facilities. The cultural database that had been extracted from the human ship's public information networks told an even more disturbing story about where these capabilities had come from. Valis reviewed the timeline of human technological development and felt a growing sense of dread. The last major Galactic War had occurred 17,000 cycles ago when the Concordat was still a young civilization, and it had been so devastating that every surviving species had agreed to strict limitations on military development. Humanity had been fighting continuously for their entire recorded history with wars that killed millions, being considered normal and acceptable parts of their civilizations. Growth. The humans had gone from primitive chemical rockets to interstellar faster than light travel in less than 2 centuries. And every major technological leap had been driven primarily by military competition between different human factions. These weren't explorers who happened to carry weapons for self-defense like most spacefaring species were. These were warriors who had learned to build starships. And there was a fundamental difference in philosophy that made Kvalith's primary heart race with anxiety. Director, the humans are requesting confirmation of our diplomatic visit, the communications officer reported. Admiral Chun has prepared a full tour of their vessel and wishes to demonstrate human hospitality. Every survival instinct that evolution had given. Kvalith screamed warnings about entering what was essentially a mobile fortress designed for extended combat operations, but Kvalith was a scientist first and understood that refusing the invitation would likely create diplomatic problems that could escalate into exactly the kind of conflict that needed to be avoided. Confirm our acceptance, Kvalith ordered while signaling the diplomatic team to prepare for transport. And make sure the Council receives our preliminary scan data immediately with highest priority encryption. Vekran approached Kvalith's station quietly. Director, are you certain this is wise? Vekran asked. If the humans have hostile intentions, we would be completely defenseless aboard their ship. Kvalith considered this carefully. If the humans wanted us dead, we would already be dead, Kvalith replied. Their weapons range exceeds ours by several orders of magnitude, and they could destroy our ship before we even registered the attack. Kvalith paused to organize their thoughts. No. The humans invited us aboard because they want something from us. Probably diplomatic recognition and trade relationships, Kvalith continued. And that gives us leverage because it means they need the Concordat's goodwill. Vekran nodded slowly, but still looked concerned. Besides, I need to see their ship with my own eyes, Kvalith added. The scans tell us what they have, but I need to understand who they are. The transport shuttle was prepared, and Kvalith selected a small team of specialists, including Vekran, a cultural analyst named Sherith, and 2 security officers who would be completely useless if things went wrong, but whose presence was diplomatically required as they approached the human warship. Kvalith got a much better visual appreciation for just how massive and intimidating the Indomitable actually was. Hull was covered with weapons emplacements and sensor arrays, and everything about the ship's design screamed function over aesthetics. This was a vessel built by a species that understood warfare at a fundamental level and had decided that Survival was more important than beauty. The shuttle bay doors opened and Kvalith's pilot navigated them inside carefully while sensors registered the multiple targeting systems that were tracking their approach. Even the receiving bay was armed. Kvalith noted with growing apprehension. The shuttle settled onto the deck plating, and Kvalith could see human crew members moving around in the background, maintaining equipment and conducting what appeared to be combat readiness drills. Admiral Chen was waiting personally to greet them, and Kvalith appreciated the gesture of respect even while noting that the humans stood in a relaxed but balanced stance that suggested readiness for immediate violence if necessary. "Welcome aboard the Indomitable," Chum said warmly with what appeared to be a genuine smile. "I'm very pleased to meet you in person." Director Kvalith. Kvalith returned the greeting in the formal Concordat style. "We are honored by your invitation, Admiral Chen," Kvalith replied, "and we look forward to learning more about your fascinating species." Chun gestured toward the exit from the hangar bay. "I thought we'd start with a tour of the ship so you can see how we live and work out here," Chun explained. "Then perhaps we can share a meal and discuss how our peoples might benefit from mutual cooperation." As they walked through the corridors, Kvalith began to understand another layer of how thoroughly humans had militarized their entire existence. The medical facilities were designed for mass casualty triage with dozens of surgical units ready to handle combat injuries. And the staff was clearly trained for battlefield medicine rather than routine healthcare. The recreational facilities included combat training areas where humans were practicing hand-to-hand fighting techniques, apparently for fun during their off-duty hours. The ship's library contained thousands of texts on military strategy, tactical analysis, historical warfare, and theoretical combat applications of new technologies. Everything about the Indomitable reflected a species that had been shaped by conflict and had learned to excel at survival through superior firepower and tactical thinking. But Kvalith also noticed other things that didn't fit the profile of mindless warmongers. There were art galleries displaying human paintings and sculptures, carefully maintained gardens growing food and flowers, and educational facilities for the children of crew members who lived aboard the ship. The humans had brought their entire civilization with them into space, including all the beauty and culture alongside the weapons and armor. "Admiral Chun," Kvalith finally asked during a pause in the tour, "why does your species build ships like this when our intelligence suggests the galaxy has been at peace for millennia?" Chun stopped walking, and a complex expression crossed her face that Kvalith's pattern recognition software struggled to interpret. "Director, humanity has only been in space for about 80 years, Chun began. "In that relatively short time, we've encountered rogue artificial intelligence that tried to exterminate our colonies. Corporate warfare over resource rights, pirate raiders attacking civilian transports, and 3 separate incidents with alien probes that attempted to sterilize human settlements." Chun gestured toward a viewport that showed the stars beyond. "The galaxy might be at peace for established civilizations that have treaties and mutual defense agreements," Chun continued, "but for newcomers like us, space is dangerous and unpredictable." She looked directly at Kvalith. "Humanity learned a very long time ago, long before we ever left Earth, that peace is something you have to be strong enough to defend," Chun explained. "Every human ship is built on one fundamental principle: hope for the best possible outcome, but prepare for the worst possible scenario." The Zethrian delegation materialized in the Indomitable's main hangar bay using their advanced transportation technology, and Kvalith immediately noticed something that sent chills through their entire nervous system. The hangar bay could obviously launch fighter craft and deploy ground troops as its primary functions. But Kvalith also observed the massive blast doors that could seal in milliseconds, and the emergency venting systems that could expose the entire space to vacuum if the ship was boarded by hostile forces. Even their receiving area was designed to serve as a tactical choke point and defensive position, which meant that humans thought about combat applications for literally every single space aboard their vessels. Admiral Chun greeted them personally with what appeared to be genuine warmth, and Gvalith tried to reconcile the friendly demeanor with the brutal efficiency of everything surrounding them. Chun's uniform was crisp and professional. Her posture was relaxed but maintained perfect balance, and Gvalith's threat assessment protocols kept flagging her as an apex predator despite the welcoming smile. "Welcome aboard," Chun said enthusiastically. "I thought we'd start with a comprehensive tour of the ship so you can see how we live and work. And then perhaps we can share a meal together." While discussing potential cooperation between our peoples, as they began walking through the corridors, Gvalith noticed the human crew members moving with practiced efficiency through their duties. Thousands of humans were working in perfect coordination throughout the ship, maintaining weapon systems, conducting combat drills, running tactical simulations, and preparing for wars that they weren't even currently fighting. It was like watching an entire civilization that existed in a permanent state of readiness for conflict. The first stop on the tour was the medical facilities, and Gvalith felt their primary heart sink when they saw what humans considered appropriate healthcare arrangements. The medical bay was designed specifically for combat triage, with dozens of surgical units ready to handle mass casualties, automated diagnostic systems that could process hundreds of wounded simultaneously, and storage for enough medical supplies to treat catastrophic losses. "Our medical staff trains constantly for battlefield conditions," Chan explained while a human doctor demonstrated some of the equipment. "We hope we never need these capabilities, but if something goes wrong, we want to be ready to save as many lives as possible." The cultural analyst Shareth whispered to Gvalith quietly, "Director, they've built their entire medical infrastructure around the assumption of mass casualties," Shareth said with barely concealed horror. "Most species have small medical bays for routine health issues, but humans expect warfare to produce hundreds of wounded crew members." Gvalith nodded grimly because the implications were becoming increasingly clear. The next section they visited was what Chung called the recreational facilities, and Gvalith discovered that humans apparently practiced violence for entertainment. During their off-duty hours, the training area showed humans engaged in hand-to-hand combat practice, simulated weapons drills, tactical scenario exercises, and what appeared to be competitive fighting sports. Physical fitness and combat readiness are important parts of our culture, Chen explained while watching two crew members sparring in a padded ring. "We believe that maintaining these skills keeps everyone sharp and ready for whatever challenges we might face." Vekran leaned close to Gvalith. "They're practicing how to kill with their bare hands," Vekran muttered, "and they're enjoying it." But Gvalith also noticed that the recreational areas included art studios, music practice rooms, and quiet reading spaces where humans were engaged in peaceful creative activities. The ship's extensive library was particularly interesting because it contained such a wide variety of materials. There were thousands of texts on military strategy and tactical theory, which Gvalith had expected, but there were also classic literature, scientific journals, philosophical treatises, and children's books. "We try to maintain a complete cultural library aboard each ship," Chum said while running her hand along a shelf of physical books. "Humanity's knowledge and creativity are just as important as our weapons and armor." Shareth examined some of the military texts and made a disturbing discovery. "Director, these strategic manuals are incredibly sophisticated," Shareth reported. "They discuss psychological warfare, economic disruption, information control, and dozens of other concepts that most species abandoned as unethical millennia ago. Kvalith took one of the books and flipped through it carefully. The text discussed warfare not as a simple matter of weapons and tactics, but as a complex interaction of politics, economics, psychology, technology, and culture. Humans had apparently spent thousands of years refining their understanding of conflict into a comprehensive science. Admiral Chun, Kvalith asked while trying to keep their voice steady. How long has your species been studying warfare at this level of sophistication? Chun considered the question thoughtfully. Humans have been writing about military strategy for at least 3,000 years, she replied. Though obviously our understanding has evolved considerably as technology and society have changed. 3,000 years of continuous refinement in the art of warfare. Kvalith thought with growing dread. The tour continued through engineering spaces, where human technicians maintained the massive reactor cores, weapons bays where ordnance specialists loaded torpedo tubes and calibrated targeting systems, and command centers where tactical officers ran endless simulation scenarios. Every single space aboard the Indomitable served a purpose, and most of those purposes related directly or indirectly to the ship's ability to fight and survive in combat. But interspersed among all the weapons and armor were gardens where crew members grew flowers and vegetables, nurseries where human children played and learned, and common areas where people gathered to share meals and conversation. The humans had somehow managed to create a functioning society inside a warship, maintaining all the elements of civilization while surrounded by instruments of destruction. Admiral Chun, Kvalith finally said during a pause in the tour. I must ask you a difficult question. Chun nodded and gestured for Kvalith to continue. Why does your species build ships like this? Kvalith asked. Our records indicate that the galaxy has been at peace for thousands of years. Yet, you've created vessels designed for sustained warfare on a scale that most civilizations cannot even imagine. Chun's expression shifted and became more serious. Director, I understand your concern, she began. From your perspective, we probably look like warmongers or aggressors. She walked to a large viewport that showed the stars beyond. But humanity's experience of the galaxy has been very different from yours. Chun continued. We've been in space for less than a century, and in that short time, we face more threats than most species encounter in millennia. Chun began counting on her fingers. Rogue artificial intelligence that viewed biological life as inefficient and tried to exterminate our colonies, she said. Corporate interests had started shooting wars over mining rights and resource extraction. Pirate organizations that prey on civilian transports and remote settlements. And 3 separate encounters with alien probe networks that attempted to sterilize human-occupied worlds. Kvalith listened with growing understanding. We didn't build the Indomitable because we want to fight, Chun explained. We built her because we've learned through painful experience that the universe is dangerous and unpredictable, especially for newcomers without established alliances or defensive treaties. She turned back to face Kvalith directly. Every system on this ship, every weapon, every piece of armor, every redundancy represents a lesson that humanity learned the hard way, Chun said. We build ships like this because we've lost ships that weren't built like this. And we've lost people who were counting on us to keep them safe. Chun's voice became quieter but more intense. The Indomitable isn't just a warship. Director, she continued. She's a promise to every human being in space that we will never abandon them, that we will always be strong enough to defend them, and that we will endure whatever challenges the universe throws at us. Kvalith felt a strange mixture of fear and respect. Your species has clearly suffered greatly, Kvalith said with genuine sympathy. Yes, we have, Chun acknowledged, but suffering has taught us resilience. And loss has taught us the value of preparation. She smiled slightly. We're warriors. Director, I won't deny that, Chun said. But we're warriors who dream of peace and work toward a future where ships like the Indomitable aren't necessary anymore. Sheriff spoke up hesitantly. Admiral, if I may ask, what would humanity do if offered a formal alliance with the Concordat and protection under our mutual defense treaties? Chen's smile widened. We would be honored and grateful, she replied immediately. Humanity wants friends and allies, not enemies. And we would much rather trade than fight. She paused. But we would still keep building ships like the Indomitable, Chen added honestly. Because ultimately, we've learned that we can only rely on ourselves for our own defense. And that's a lesson we'll never forget. Gvalith understood completely humanity had been forged by hardship into something unique and terrifying. But they remained fundamentally hopeful and reaching toward connection. Gvalith's official report to the Galactic Concordat took 3 full days to compile properly, because there was so much data to organize and analyze, and every conclusion seemed to contradict the established understanding of how peaceful spacefaring civilizations were supposed to develop. The primary analysis section contained every scan result from the Indomitable, complete technical specifications of human weapon systems, biological assessments of human resilience and adaptability, and detailed observations from the diplomatic visit. But as Gvalith sat in their private quarters aboard the Harmonious, inquiry and prepared to write the final recommendation section, they found themselves struggling with competing imperatives. The obvious conclusion, based purely on military capability assessment, was to classify humanity as an unprecedented threat level, recommend immediate quarantine of human space, and begin preparations for potential defensive operations. The numbers supported this recommendation completely because humanity possessed weapons technology that could devastate Concordat defensive positions, tactical doctrine that was more sophisticated than anything in current military databases, and a cultural psychology that normalized sustained warfare. But Gvalith kept remembering other details from the visit that complicated the simple threat assessment. They remembered Admiral Chun's genuine smile when showing the delegation through the ship's recreation areas where human children were learning art and music alongside their academic studies. They remembered the chef named Rodriguez, who had spent hours researching Z3 biochemistry and preparing a meal that was not only safe for Gvalith to consume, but actually delicious, just to make their guests feel welcome and honored. They remembered the young engineer named Kim, who had excitedly explained every system aboard the Indomitable with obvious pride and affection, treating the warship like a beloved family member rather than just a military asset. They remembered the gardens where crew members grew flowers that served no tactical purpose whatsoever, maintained purely because humans found beauty and peace in living things. Humans were absolutely terrifying from a military standpoint, but they were also kind, curious, creative, and desperately hopeful about finding friends among the stars. Gvalith began writing the final section of the report with careful consideration for every word. Humanity represents an unprecedented military capability in galactic space, Gvalith wrote. Their warships exceed our current defensive parameters by significant margins. Their tactical doctrine demonstrates sophistication that rivals or exceeds our own historical military thinking. And their capacity for sustained conflict operations is unmatched in any civilization's recorded history. Gvalith paused to review the cultural analysis data. However, this council must understand that humanity's military capabilities did not develop from aggressive expansionism or conquest ideology. Gvalith continued. Human civilization was forged through thousands of years of internal conflict and external threats, and every aspect of their current military posture represents hard-learned lessons in survival. Kvalith added detailed supporting evidence from the cultural database. Humanity only achieved spaceflight capability approximately 80 standard years ago. Yet in that brief period, they have faced rogue artificial intelligence, corporate warfare, organized piracy, and multiple encounters with hostile autonomous systems, Kvalith explained. Their military development is a direct response to legitimate survival threats, not preparation for conquest. The next section was the most important because it would shape how the Concordat responded to humanity's emergence. This council recommends immediate diplomatic engagement rather than isolation or defensive posturing. Kvalith wrote with firm conviction. Humanity has weaponized their entire civilization, not out of aggression, but out of necessity. And their primary motivation appears to be protection of their people, rather than expansion through conquest. Kvalith elaborated on the reasoning. The galaxy faces a critical choice in how we respond to humanity's arrival. Kvalith continued, we can treat them as enemies based solely on their military capabilities, which would likely create a self-fulfilling prophecy and result in facing the most dangerous military force in known space. Kvalith paused to consider the alternative path. Or we can extend friendship and alliance to a species that desperately wants peaceful cooperation, but has learned through bitter experience to remain prepared for the worst. Kvalith wrote, if we choose the path of alliance, we gain protectors who will never abandon those they have sworn to defend, and partners who value loyalty and commitment above all else. The cultural analysis had revealed something important about human psychology. Humans possess a powerful cultural trait that they call honor, which creates strong obligations toward allies and partners. Kvalith explained, once humans commit to protecting someone, they will endure enormous costs and sacrifices rather than break that commitment. Kvalith added historical examples from human culture. Their own history demonstrates this repeatedly, with humans fighting desperate defensive battles to protect allies, even when retreat would have been strategically sensible. Kvalith noted, this loyalty extends to incredible extremes, including individuals sacrificing their own lives to save comrades or protect civilians. The conclusion section required the most careful wording. I have personally observed humanity aboard their warship, Indomitable, and spoken at length with Admiral Chun and her crew. Kvalith wrote, they are warriors without question, shaped by conflict and prepared for violence, but they are also dreamers who hope for peace and actively seek connection with other species. Kvalith thought about the meal they had shared with the human crew. They maintain art galleries and gardens aboard their warships. Kvalith continued, they raise their children in the same vessels that carry their most destructive weapons, teaching them culture and creativity alongside tactical thinking. Kvalith added the most important observation. Humans understand that they appear frightening to species that have lived in peace for millennia. Kvalith wrote, Admiral Chun explicitly acknowledged this and expressed hope that humanity could prove themselves worthy of friendship through actions rather than just words. The final recommendation was clear in Kvalith's mind. This council should immediately establish formal diplomatic relations with humanity, offer them membership in the Concordat's mutual defense agreements, and begin cultural exchange programs. Kvalith wrote, we should leverage humanity's military capabilities as assets for collective security, rather than allowing them to become threats through isolation. Kvalith added a personal note at the end. I know which future I choose. Kvalith wrote, I choose the future where humanity stands with us as friends and allies, where their remarkable resilience and tactical brilliance serve the cause of peace, and where we help them achieve the peaceful civilization they dream of building. Before transmitting the report, Kvalith attached all the supporting documentation, including the complete scan data, cultural analysis files, and recordings from the diplomatic visit. Report transmitted through secure channels directly to the Concordat Council chambers. And Caliph sat back feeling both exhausted and strangely hopeful. Vakran entered the quarters quietly. Director, the report has been received, and the council has scheduled an emergency session to review it, Vakran said. They're requesting your presence for testimony. Caliph nodded slowly. How do you think they'll respond? Vakran asked. I honestly don't know, Galath admitted. Fear is a powerful motivator, and humanity gives us plenty of reasons to be afraid. Kval stood and walked to the viewport. But I hope the council will see what I saw. Kvalath continued. Not just warriors with incredible weapons, but people who are reaching toward the light despite coming from darkness. Vakran was quiet for a moment. The Admiral gave you something before we left, Vakran said. What was it? Groloth retrieved the package from their personal storage. It was a physical book printed on actual paper, which was a rare and valuable format that humans still used for important texts. Title read, The Art of War by someone named Sun Tzu. And it was apparently one of humanity's ancient military philosophy texts. Gwolf had read the entire book during the journey back to Concordat space and found it both disturbing and enlightening. One passage kept returning to Kvaleth's thoughts. The human philosopher had written that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Gwolf understood the implication. Perhaps humanity had already won simply by being so overwhelmingly prepared for conflict that no rational enemy would ever choose to fight them. Perhaps the galaxy had already been conquered in a sense, just not through violence or aggression, and perhaps, Kvala thought while looking at the stars, that wasn't such a terrible outcome if it meant everyone could live in peace under the protection of warriors who valued honor and loyalty. The communication system chimed with an incoming message from Admiral Chun, Director Kvaleth. I wanted to thank you personally for the visit and for taking the time to understand humanity, Chun's message said. I know we probably seem scary to peaceful species, but I hope you'll give us a chance to prove that we can be good neighbors and reliable Fari.